Hey, Reddit. I was a cop for 15 years, and I have a story to tell. It started with a guy named Jason Mitchell. Average dude, mid-30s, worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm. He wasn't from around here, moved to our little slice of upstate New York from Chicago after a bad breakup. He wanted a fresh start, a new life away from the noise. He found a dirt-cheap apartment in a red brick building on the edge of town. The kind of place where the radiators hissed, and the stairwell always smelled like stale cigarettes and old paint. The building itself was a relic. 3 floors, sagging fire escapes, and those old, creaky wooden floors that seemed to groan whenever you took a step. It had character, sure, but also that lingering sadness old buildings sometimes have, like they remembered too much. The landlord, Mr. Rosenthal, was this grizzled old guy with a bad hip and a love for Sinatra. He told Jason the place was a steal. And it was. Maybe too good of a deal, in hindsight. The first few weeks were fine. Jason settled in, set up his work-from-home station by the big window overlooking the street, and even started jogging in the mornings. He'd chat with Mrs. Harper, the old lady on the first floor who always sat by her window, waving at passers-by. Or with Tim, the college kid upstairs, who constantly reeked of weed but had a good heart. Normal, mundane stuff. But then the sound started. At first, it was just a soft scraping. Jason told us later he thought it was mice or maybe Tim moving furniture around. It was old wood, after all. But the scraping became a grinding, a slow, unsettling noise that seemed to rise up from the floorboards at odd hours. He'd be sitting at his desk, working on some logo, and suddenly, it'd feel like the entire apartment was breathing around him, the walls stretching and groaning. One night, he woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise that he said sounded like metal dragging against stone. It came from behind the walls, underneath the floor, everywhere and nowhere at once. He checked every room, opened closets, even crawled under the bed. Nothing. Just silence, and that thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow his little flashlight beam. Jason told Mrs. Harper about it. She just smiled, a thin, strained kind of smile, and told him the building was old, that it made noises. Tim joked that it was haunted, probably by the ghost of Mr. Rosenthal's first wife, who allegedly died in the building years ago. But Jason wasn't laughing. It was a few days after that when he decided to take a walk to clear his head. There's a patch of woods behind the apartment complex, just past the cracked basketball court and the rusting chain-link fence. Not exactly the kind of place you'd want to be after dark, but Jason needed the fresh air. The trees were thin and bare, their branches clawing at the overcast sky, and the ground was soft with last night's rain. He wandered for a while, letting the quiet soak into his bones. That's when he found it, the well. It was old, made of crumbling stones and covered in a shroud of moss and brittle vines. It sat in the middle of a small clearing, like something out of a fairy tale, except everything about it felt wrong. The air around it was colder, and the earth seemed to dip slightly, as if the well was pulling the world into its dark, gaping mouth. Jason swore he heard a voice. Just a soft, distant whisper. He leaned closer, his fingers curling over the slick, wet stones, and called out. Nothing. Just the hollow echo of his own voice bouncing back up. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again. Softer this time, like a secret being shared through layers of dirt and stone. He didn't tell anyone about the well. Not at first. He was a logical guy, the kind who needed explanations for things. He figured it was stress, maybe his mind playing tricks on him. But after that day, the sounds in the apartment changed. They weren't just grinding or scraping anymore. Now, they had a rhythm. A cadence. Like someone muttering just beneath the floor, words he couldn't quite make out but felt, deep in his bones. Jason started losing sleep. He'd lie in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, his breath shallow, waiting for the sounds. He started drinking more, cheap whiskey bottles piling up in the kitchen. His work slipped. His boss called, concerned, but Jason just mumbled excuses. His texts to friends back in Chicago became shorter, less frequent, until they stopped altogether. And still, every night, the sounds came. And now, sometimes, when he woke up in the dark, he'd hear the voice from the well. Except this time, it wasn't distant. It was right there, breathing against his ear, slipping into his mind. Jason's mental state started unraveling, and it showed. He stopped jogging. Stopped talking to Mrs. Harper. Even Tim noticed something was off. He told me later that Jason's eyes had this hollow look, like he wasn't fully there. Jason started avoiding people, slipping out of his apartment only when he needed food or more booze. He barely ate, mostly living off instant noodles and stale cereal. His sink filled with dishes, the trash overflowed, and the apartment took on this damp, sour smell. The kind that clings to you. The windows stayed shut, the blinds drawn tight, locking him in a world of dim, muted gray. But the voice, that damn voice, became his only company. At first, it was just at night. Jason would wake up to the sound of it, soft and coaxing. He couldn't tell if it was speaking English or just sounds that felt like words, but he listened. He couldn't help it. It was like his mind leaned into it, desperate to catch every whisper. Then, the voice started during the day. It came from behind the walls while he worked, hummed through the floor when he sat on the couch. Jason started talking back. At first, just muttering, asking it to stop. But the voice never did. It filled the silence, threaded itself through the grinding and scraping, until it became a part of his every thought. It told him things. Little things, at first. Don't answer the phone. Don't go outside. The mailman is watching you. Jason would find himself standing by the peephole for hours, staring at the empty hallway, waiting for something. He didn't know what. One rainy afternoon, Jason went back to the well. His clothes were rumpled, stained with sweat. He hadn't showered in days, and his skin itched under the weight of dirt and paranoia. The forest was quiet, the wet leaves sagging under the drizzle, the ground sucking at his sneakers as he trudged forward. The well stood where he left it, dark and damp, a gaping wound in the earth. He leaned over the edge, his breath fogging up in the cold air. "What do you want?" he whispered. The answer came back, soft and smooth, like a snake slipping through tall grass. "You know." He sat by the well for hours, soaking in the cold, his jeans damp and his fingers blue. When he finally stood, his knees popped, his whole body creaking like an old door. He walked back to the apartment, and the voice came with him. That night, it gave him his first real command. There was a stray cat that used to hang around the back alley. A skinny tabby with matted fur and a notched ear. The voice told Jason to take it. To hurt it. Jason tried to resist. He really did. But the voice pressed into him, its whispers growing sharper, a constant, grating rasp that scraped against his skull. So, he did it. He lured the cat with a piece of bologna, his hands trembling, eyes darting to the shadows. He took it to the woods, to the well. His mind went somewhere else while he did it, someplace dark and cold, where he couldn't feel his hands, couldn't hear the wet crunch of bones. When it was done, he tossed the limp, broken body into the well. The darkness swallowed it whole. And then, for the first time in weeks, the voice went silent. He stumbled home, his clothes stained, his mind a foggy mess. He slept for 12 hours straight, and when he woke up, he felt good. Clear-headed. The grinding in the walls was gone. The apartment was silent, blissfully so. He almost cried from the relief. But it didn't last. The voice came back. Hungrier this time. It started pushing him, slipping into his thoughts, nudging him with darker, sharper suggestions. He started stealing. Not because he needed to, but because the voice told him to. Little things at first, a candy bar from the corner store, a pack of batteries. Then bigger things. He broke into a closed stall at the farmer's market, knocking over crates of apples and bread, shoving whatever he could into his backpack. Every time he did what the voice asked, it went quiet for a bit. And Jason lived for that silence, for those brief, fleeting moments of peace. But then, the voice started asking for more. Whispering about the people around him. The old lady downstairs. The delivery guy who brought him takeout. It told him their secrets, real or imagined, until Jason couldn't look at them without feeling the itch in his brain, the sharp sting of doubt. And then it happened. One cold, brittle morning, Jason woke up with his hands wrapped around his own neck, the voice purring in his ear, telling him to end it. Or, if he couldn't, to make someone else go away. Permanently. That's when the real nightmare began. After that morning, Jason stopped pretending he had control. The voice became his compass, guiding him through the twisted maze his life had become. He moved through his days in a daze, barely eating, barely sleeping. The world around him felt distant, like he was watching his own life through a dirty window. He spent more time in the woods, by the well. It became his sanctuary, a place where the voice felt strongest. He'd sit on the wet ground, fingers tracing the cold, damp stones, whispering back to the voice. He asked it questions. Sometimes it answered, sometimes it just laughed, a soft, guttural sound that buzzed under his skin. It gave him tasks. Little missions to prove his loyalty. It started with animals. More strays, a raccoon he trapped behind the dumpsters, even a bird he knocked out of a tree with a rock. The forest floor became his butcher's block, and the well swallowed each offering with a silence that gnawed at him. The voice rewarded him with peace, with that blissful quiet he craved. But the silence never lasted. One night, the voice woke him up, whispering his name. His bedroom was dark, the kind of dark where shadows seemed to crawl across the walls. He lay still, his body heavy, blankets twisted around him like a shroud. "Do you trust me?" the voice asked. "Yes," he breathed. "Prove it." The voice told him to leave. To go outside, barefoot, in nothing but his boxers and a threadbare t-shirt. The winter air cut into his skin, sharp and wet. His feet slapped against the concrete, raw and red, as he made his way down the street. He passed empty houses, dark windows watching him. The voice guided him, pulling him toward the little convenience store by the train tracks. It was past midnight. The store was closed, metal shutters drawn down over grimy windows. Jason stood in front of it, shivering, teeth clattering. His breath fogged up, clouding his vision. "Take what's yours." He found a rock, smooth and heavy, half buried in the frostbitten grass. He didn't think. His arm moved on its own, the rock crashing against the glass, again and again, until shards scattered around his feet like jagged teeth. An alarm screamed into the night. Red lights flashed, painting the world in violent, pulsing hues. Jason didn't care. He crawled through the window, skin tearing against glass, hands grabbing at whatever was within reach. Candy bars, a pack of cigarettes, a bottle of cheap vodka. He stuffed them into his shirt, blood smearing across white fabric. The police found him sitting on the curb, crunching a Snickers, his feet blue and his eyes blank. They didn't even cuff him, just wrapped him in a scratchy blanket and led him to the back of the cruiser. Mr. Rosenthal bailed him out. The old man looked smaller, his thick coat hanging off his frame, his hands shaking as he signed the paperwork. He drove Jason back to the apartment, neither of them speaking. When they reached the door, Rosenthal finally looked at him, his eyes dark and tired. "Get help, kid," he said. "Whatever's going on, it's eating you alive." Jason nodded, but he wasn't listening. The voice was already whispering again, soft and sweet, drowning out everything else. The next few days blurred together. Jason locked himself in his apartment, the curtains drawn tight, the world outside a distant hum. He didn't eat. Didn't sleep. Just sat on the floor, knees to his chest, listening to the voice. It filled every crack in his mind, seeped into his dreams, turned his thoughts into static. And then, it gave him the final choice. It came at night, the voice wrapping around him like a lover's arms. There are two ways out, it said. End yourself, or end someone else. Jason didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just nodded, his body moving on autopilot. He slipped into his jacket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of a kitchen knife he tucked into his pocket. The streets were empty, the air sharp and still. Jason wandered, his steps uneven, his mind a dark, buzzing void. He ended up by the train station, where the few late-night stragglers moved like ghosts under the streetlights. He spotted her by the ticket booth. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled into a messy bun, a puffy coat swallowing her frame. She was on the phone, her voice a soft murmur against the night. Jason moved closer, the knife heavy in his pocket, the voice guiding his every step. It happened fast. He grabbed her, his hand clamping over her mouth, the knife slipping between ribs, warm blood spilling over his hands. She struggled, her body jerking, her phone clattering to the ground, the screen cracked and smeared red. Jason didn't feel anything. Not guilt, not fear, just an overwhelming, smothering silence. He dragged her through the woods, her feet leaving trails in the damp earth. The well stood waiting, its dark mouth open, eager. He pushed her in, her body crumpling into the dark. And then, nothing. The voice was gone. For the first time in months, Jason was truly alone. He stumbled back to the apartment, his clothes soaked, his hands sticky and cold. He sat in his living room, the silence pressing against him, heavy and suffocating. When the police came, he didn't resist. They found him sitting on the floor, the knife still in his lap, dried blood under his nails. He confessed to everything. Told them about the voice, the well, the animals, the woman. I was there when they put him in the back of the squad car. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw relief in them. Jason Mitchell is in a maximum security prison now. They say he mostly keeps to himself. Doesn't talk to the other inmates, just sits by the window, staring into nothing. And me? I still think about that well. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear it. The soft, scratching whisper of a voice, calling my name. When Jason finally cracked, it sent ripples through the entire town. The news ran his mugshot everywhere, wild hair, sunken eyes, skin a sickly shade of gray. People couldn't believe it. The quiet guy from 4B. The one who helped Mrs. Harper carry her groceries. It didn't make sense. I remember standing in the precinct, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over everything. The room smelled of stale coffee in damp winter coats. Jason sat in the interrogation room, hands cuffed to the metal table. His fingers were raw, nails chipped and dirty. He barely blinked, his gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. Detective Maria Bennett and I were assigned to the case. She was sharp, no nonsense, the kind of person who could peel the truth out of a stone-cold liar. But with Jason, she didn't need to. He talked freely, his voice flat and hollow, as if he were reciting someone else's story. He told us about the voice, about the well. His words tumbled out in a disjointed stream, bits of memory mixed with half-formed thoughts. He spoke about the animals, the little crimes, how the voice guided him, how it became his only friend. And the woman? Maria asked, her voice steady. Jason's lips twitched, not quite a smile. It told me to choose, he said. Her or me. Silence settled over the room, thick and uncomfortable. I could see Maria's jaw tighten, a muscle flexing beneath her skin. We followed Jason's directions to the well. The forest was a mess of ice and mud, our boots sinking into the ground with every step. Birds squawked overhead, their calls sharp and jarring against the winter silence. When we reached the well, it looked ordinary. Old, Sure, with crumbling stones and moss creeping over its edges, but nothing sinister. If I hadn't known what lay inside, I might have walked right by it. But when we looked down, flashlights cutting through the dark, there she was. Her body lay crumpled, twisted unnaturally, her pale skin stark against the wet stones. The smell hit us first, a rancid, sour wave that made my stomach turn. It took hours to pull her out. The forensics team moved carefully, their voices low and grim. Maria stood by the well, arms crossed, her breath clouding in the cold air. I knew that look, the one where she was burying everything deep, locking it away until the job was done. We identified her as Melissa Harper, a 34-year-old kindergarten teacher. She'd been reported missing 2 days earlier, her friends plastering her face all over social media. Seeing the posters, her bright smile and hopeful eyes, made the reality of what happened even worse. Back at the precinct, Jason sat where we left him. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. His expression remained vacant, his body sagging against the chair like he was held together by nothing but gravity. When I sat across from him, he finally looked up. His eyes were glassy, bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Is it gone?" I asked. He blinked. "What?" "The voice. Is it still talking to you?" For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No. It's quiet now." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe him, to think that maybe, finally, he'd found peace. But another part, a darker part, wondered if the silence was just another trick, another trap. Jason was transferred to a maximum security prison within a week. The trial was quick, he pled guilty to everything. There was no insanity plea, no attempt to wiggle out of responsibility. He just accepted his fate, as if it were the only logical end to his story. Life moved on. Mrs. Harper moved out of the building, couldn't handle the memories. Tim, the handyman, told me he still heard things in the walls, the same grinding and scraping Jason had described. He said it with a nervous laugh, but his eyes darted around, never settling on one spot for too long. I couldn't shake it either. The well haunted me. I started dreaming about it, waking up with the taste of dirt and rot in my mouth. Sometimes, while driving, I'd find myself heading toward the woods, my hands gripping the wheel tight, my knuckles white. One evening, after a few too many drinks, I drove out there. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, the world cast in shades of blue and gray. The forest swallowed me up, branches clawing at my jacket, wet leaves slapping against my legs. When I reached the well, it looked different. The stones seemed darker, the shadows around it deeper. I stood there, my breath hitching, my pulse thumping in my ears. I thought I heard it then, a soft whisper, curling up from the darkness below. My name, drawn out and sweet. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the wet ground, and bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands fumbling with the keys, the engine roaring to life. I drove home, locked the doors, and sat on the kitchen floor until the sun came up. I haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear it. That voice, just on the edge of sleep. It tells me things, soft and low, promises of silence, of peace. And God help me, sometimes I want to listen. After that night, I tried to bury the well, the voice, all of it. I threw myself into work, picked up extra shifts, buried my mind in the everyday grind of paperwork, patrols, and the humdrum chaos of the precinct. Detective Bennett and I closed a few cases, nothing too heavy, petty thefts, a domestic dispute, a few drug busts. But no matter how deep I waded into the normal, the shadows of Jason's story lingered, curling around the edges of my thoughts. It didn't help that the apartment building couldn't shake the stain of what happened. Even with Jason locked away, 4B sat empty. I heard through Tim, the building's handyman, that potential tenants would come by, take one look at the place, and leave. Mr. Rosenthal dropped the rent price, did some renovations, slapped on a fresh coat of paint, but it didn't matter. The apartment had a weight to it, a kind of heaviness that seeped into your skin. Tim stopped by the precinct a few weeks after the trial. He looked rough, pale, eyes ringed with purple, his jacket hanging off him like a wet towel. He pulled me aside, his breath sour with coffee and cigarettes, and told me he couldn't keep working there. "I hear it," he whispered, his voice tight. "When I'm in the basement, fixing the pipes. In the stairwell, when the wind blows. It's just, there." "What do you hear?" I asked, my chest tightening. He stared at me, his eyes wide and wet. "Scratching. Like something's trying to get out." He quit the next day. People started moving out. First, Mrs. Harper packed up her things, dragging her life out in cardboard boxes, her face drawn and hollow. Then the young couple on the third floor, the ones with the crying baby. By spring, half the building was empty, windows dark, mailboxes stuffed with unclaimed letters. I should have stayed away. I should have let it go. But every time I drove by, the building seemed to pull at me, a soft tug at the back of my mind. I found myself parking across the street, watching it. Lights would flicker on and off, shadows moved behind curtains, but it was all wrong. Too empty, too still. One night, I couldn't help myself. I crossed the street, my breath clouding in the cool air, my shoes crunching over salt and grit. The front door was unlocked, the lobby dimly lit, the old floral wallpaper peeling in the corners. I walked the halls, my footsteps echoing. Every door was shut tight, the building holding its breath. I found myself outside 4B, my hand resting on the doorknob. The air felt thick, heavy. My skin prickled, a shiver crawling up my spine. The door opened with a groan, the darkness inside swallowing me up. The apartment looked untouched. Furniture still in place, dust settling over the countertops. Jason's life, frozen in time. The couch where he sat, listening to the voice. The kitchen where he probably made sad, lonely dinners, stirring canned soup in a chipped pot. I moved through the rooms, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The bathroom mirror was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures. The bedroom smelled stale, the sheets still rumpled, the pillow dented where his head had rested. And then, in the corner of the bedroom, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic grinding. My pulse pounded, a heavy thud in my ears. I stood still, the light trembling in my hand. The sound grew, the grinding turning into a scrape, a slow, deliberate noise that crawled under my skin. I forced myself to move, to push through the haze of fear. The sound led me to the closet. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin line of black between the wood and the frame. I reached out, fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle. The door swung open, the shadows inside swallowing my light. The scraping sound exploded, loud and sharp, and I stumbled back, my back hitting the wall. Nothing was there. But the sound didn't stop. It filled the room, a chorus of scratching, grinding, a desperate clawing that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the air itself. I bolted. I tore through the apartment, down the stairs, out into the street, my lungs burning, my skin crawling. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, the door slamming behind me, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. When I got home, I sat in my driveway for hours, the engine running, headlights casting long, pale beams across the empty street. The next morning, I called in sick. I sat in my apartment, blinds drawn, TV on low, trying to drown out the whispers in my head. I kept hearing it. The grinding, the scratching. At first, it was only at night, when the world was quiet. But then it crept into the day, underneath conversations, behind the hum of my computer, woven into the white noise of the city. The voice hadn't gone away. It had just found someone new. The days after my visit to 4B blurred together. I hardly left my apartment. Calls from Detective Bennett went unanswered, my inbox flooded with unread messages from the precinct. Food went stale on the counter, coffee sat cold in mugs, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror became a stranger, hollow cheeks, red-rimmed eyes, a fine sheen of sweat that never seemed to go away. The voice whispered to me in those quiet hours. At first, it was just the grinding, the scraping sound gnawing at my sanity. But as the days dragged on, words began to emerge. Soft, coaxing, wrapping around my thoughts like smoke. It told me things, little nudges at first. Skip work. Don't answer the phone. Lock the door. Stay inside. I listened, not because I believed it, but because it was easier. The outside world felt sharp and hostile, like sunlight on an open wound. But it didn't stop there. The voice grew bolder. Go back to the well, it murmured. There's something you need to see. I fought it for days. I tried to drown it out with the TV, with music, with the desperate thud of my own heartbeat. But nothing helped. It followed me everywhere, an echo that never faded. One evening, as the sky turned a muddy gray, I found myself standing by my front door, keys in hand. My body moved on its own, a puppet on invisible strings. I drove through town, past empty storefronts and shuttered windows, the world blurring by in smudges of light and color. The forest was waiting for me. Cold air bit at my skin, the trees standing tall and silent, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. My feet crunched over frost-bitten leaves, the earth hard beneath my boots. The well loomed ahead, a black pit against the pale earth. The stones were slick with moss, the air around it damp and heavy. I stood at the edge, peering into the dark, my breath clouding the air. Jump, the voice urged. It's the only way. My knees wobbled, my toes nudging the lip of the well. The darkness seemed to pulse, a deep, endless void that promised quiet. Relief. But then, a sound, a rustle behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. Detective Bennett stood a few feet away, her gun drawn, her expression tight and wary. Tom, she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the fog in my mind. Step away from the well. I blinked, the world snapping back into focus. The voice hissed, sharp and angry, but I forced myself to listen to her, to the real sound of her voice. She moved closer, her boots crunching over the ground, and I could see the strain in her face, the fear. She'd been watching me, following me, piecing it all together while I unraveled. Come on, she said, softer now. Let's get you out of here. Her hand reached out, and I took it. The weeks that followed were a blur of therapy sessions, medication, sleepless nights under harsh hospital lights. They said I'd had a breakdown, stress-induced psychosis. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to accept the pills, the diagnosis, the safe, sterile explanation for everything. But I knew better. Jason wasn't crazy. I wasn't crazy. The well, the voice, it was real. When I got out, I moved away. I left the force, packed up what little I had, and drove until the town was nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. I found a small place out west, somewhere with open skies and dry air, far away from forests and dark, damp places. For a while, it worked. The voice faded, the world brightened. I even started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I'd escaped it. But last night, I woke up around 3 a.m., the room dark and silent. My mouth was dry, my pulse slow and heavy. I sat up, wiping the sweat from my brow, and that's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic grinding. Somewhere in the walls. Or maybe just behind my eyes. The voice hasn't spoken yet. But I know it's only a matter of time. And this time, hey, Reddit. I was a cop for 50